All right, Hotep everybody. Hey, this is Michael Imhotep, founder of the African History Network, host of the African History Network show. I'm a talk show host, researcher, lecturer, and writer. It is Monday, June 24th, 2019, and we are live. Hope everybody's doing well. So we should be broadcasting on Facebook Live. Let's start this on Facebook Live, and we'll be broadcasting on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, also. Okay, so let's start that up. I'm broadcasting through Crowdcast and still have to get used to this because it allows me to broadcast on our YouTube channel and Facebook at the same time. Okay, so trying to start this up. All right, so I hope everybody's doing well today. I wanted to talk about this topic. So on my Sunday night show, the African History Network show on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation, Sunday, June 23rd, I talked about the H.R.40 hearing, the hearings that took place in the House Judiciary Subcommittee dealing with H.R.40 and reparations, okay? So watch that on our YouTube channel, and it's on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. And in that show, one of the things I talked about briefly was the GI Bill, okay? The GI Bill and how the GI Bill discriminated against African American soldiers, okay? So June 22nd was the anniversary of President Roosevelt signing the GI Bill into law. So it was June 22nd, 1944, all right? Okay, we're broadcasting, let's see, on our YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep, I-M-H-O-T-E-P, and we're broadcasting on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. So how's everybody doing? And then also in Crowdcast, we have Greg Osborne watching us in Crowdcast as well, okay? And while we're broadcasting, I'll also talk a little bit about the online course that I'm teaching, the 8-week 16-hour online course that I'm teaching, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school, all right? And you can watch from around the world. We do it live on Wednesdays, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then all the classes are archived also, okay? So we'll post information here in the thread of the broadcast about that as well. Okay, so I talked a little bit at the end of the show about the GI Bill, but I ran out of time, didn't have time to get into it. Now, at the hearing, if you saw it, and we shared the broadcast while it was live, taking place Wednesday, June 19th, Economist Dr. Julianne Malveaux talked about the GI Bill and how it discriminated against African American World War II veterans and later other veterans who were trying to use the GI Bill to get low interest loans to buy houses, go to school, etc. Okay, so History.com, the official website of the History Channel, has some good articles here dealing with the GI Bill. So we're going to get into this, and then also you've heard me talk about the GI Bill before because in the book How White Folks Got So Rich: The Untold Story of American White Supremacy. They deal with this as well. Okay. All right. So let's jump into this, and let me share this broadcast also as well. Share this on my personal page. Everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in, and then African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. We'll let you know how you can advertise also with the African History Network. Okay, so History.com has a really good article. FDR signs GI Bill. FDR, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signs GI Bill. Okay, and that took place June 22nd, 1944, and it took place about 2 or 3 weeks after the Normandy invasion of France, which was June 6, 1944. So we just commemorated the 75th anniversary of the invasion of Normandy. 155,000 U.S. troops invade Normandy. There were almost 2,000 African Americans who were part of that. For some reason, they didn't talk about the African American troops that invaded. They just acted like they didn't exist. All right, but on June 22nd, 1944, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt signs the GI Bill. Now, the GI Bill was an unprecedented act, okay? An unprecedented act of legislation designed to compensate returning members of the armed services, known as GIs, stands for government issue, known as GIs, for their efforts in World War II. Now, as the last of its sweeping New Deal reforms, so the New Deal is a group of bills that President Roosevelt signs during the Great Depression, and this helps provide aid to largely white people, to a lesser extent African Americans, during the Great Depression. All right, so this was the last of a sweeping New Deal reforms. President Roosevelt's administration created the GI Bill, officially called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, and signing this, he was hoping to avoid a relapse into the Great Depression after the World War II ended. So World War II ends basically in 1945. So President Roosevelt particularly wanted to prevent a repeat of the Bonus March of 1932. And this occurred when you had 20,000 unemployed veterans and their families who flocked in protest to Washington, D.C. So the GI Bill is to provide aid to these veterans when they're coming back home from the war. All right, and we know that the baby boomer generation starts basically 1945, 1946. These men are coming back. They're having families. They have to buy houses. Their families are expanding, and the GI Bill was designed to give them low interest loans so they could go to college, get low interest loans so they could buy homes, and also low interest loans so they can start businesses. All right, so these men wouldn't come back, be unemployed. They can gain skills and go to college, start careers, buy homes, etc. Now, at the same time, you're going to have the Federal Housing Act of 1949. This is also going to allow white people to put 3% down on low interest loans and get houses built out in the newly formed suburbs. The GI Bill is for veterans. The Federal Housing Act was for basically the majority of white people. When African Americans tried to take advantage of the Federal Housing Act of 1949, we were discriminated against that, and they used the redlining system. The redlining system was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was created in 1933 as part of the New Deal. Okay, and the redlining system discriminated against African Americans trying to buy homes, and when we tried to buy homes using the GI Bill, we were discriminated once again. So when we heard our sister Dr. Julianne Malveaux at the H.R.40 reparations hearings, she's talking about how systemic racism, she's talking about how policies have been put in place to maldistribute wealth, okay, and how African Americans were discriminated against when it comes to accumulating wealth. That these are all legacies of slavery. All right, so we have to understand this chronology of history. Okay, so President Roosevelt particularly wanted to prevent a repeat of the Bonus March in 1932, when 20,000 unemployed veterans and their families flocked in protest to Washington. Now, the American Legion, which was a veterans organization, successfully fought for many other provisions that were included in the GI Bill, which gave returning servicemen access to unemployment compensation, low-interest home and low-interest business loans, and most importantly, funding for education, funding for higher education, going to college. And the GI Bill is going to drastically increase the number of Americans that enroll in college. All right. Now, by giving veterans money for tuition, living expenses, books, supplies, and equipment, the GI Bill effectively transformed higher education in America. So before World War II, college had often been looked at as an option for only 10 to 15% of young Americans. Okay, largely just looked at something that the elite did. Okay, and university campuses had become known as a haven for the most privileged classes. Well, by 1945, 2 years after World War II ends, veterans made up half of the nation's college enrollment, and 3 years later, in 1950, nearly 500,000 Americans graduated from college. Now, if we look at 1939, you only had 160,000 Americans graduated from college. So because of the GI Bill, just in that short period of time, from basically looking at 1945, okay, 46 to 1950, we see the numbers of Americans graduating, that almost triples the number that graduated in 1939. You had 160,000 who graduated in 1939 from colleges and universities in the U.S. In 1950, it was 500,000. This is because of government policy. So when people, now what I find interesting is that you'll have people who say, well, you know, nobody who was a slave, nobody who owned slaves exists now, things like this, right? But when you look at the GI Bill, here you have taxpayers paying for the GI Bill. It's the taxpayers who did not serve in the war were paying for the GI Bill, paying for men who did serve in the war to go to college. You had African Americans who didn't serve in the war who were paying taxes, and their taxpayer dollars are paying for this also. But many of them are being discriminated against, taking advantage of the GI Bill. You know, I find that interesting. Some of the same people against socialism support the GI Bill. Now, as educational institutions open their doors to this diverse new group of students, okay, as educational institutions open their doors to this diverse new group of students, overcrowded classrooms and residences prompted widespread improvement and expansion of university facilities and teaching staffs. Okay, so as you have more Americans, largely white men, because this is the majority of who served in World War II. There were 1.2 million African American soldiers who served in World War II, but they're largely discriminated against when it comes to using the GI Bill. So as more Americans are going to college, now this causes the colleges have to upgrade. They have to add more classes, they have to expand, they have to add more teaching staff, more professors. Okay? So an array of new vocational courses were developed across the country, including advanced training in education, agriculture, commerce, mining, and fishing skills that had previously been taught only informally. The GI Bill became one of the major forces that drove an economic expansion in America that lasted 30 years after World War II. So even people who didn't serve in World War II, their taxpayer dollars are paying for this. The GI Bill helped to transform America and helped to move many of these white American families into the middle class because the man was able to go to college, get training, and get a career. Get into a career, and then he was able to take out low interest loans to buy homes, largely in the newly formed suburbs that African Americans couldn't buy homes in. So now they can buy homes, they can accumulate wealth when it comes to the increased value of their home. They can pay that home off in 30 years and hand down and pass on an asset to their children when the parent dies. They can pass on an asset, pass on a house that is paid for free and clear. And then if the children want to, they can live in this house, don't have to pay a mortgage, just have to pay the property taxes, or they can rent that house out to someone else and have an income producing asset. This is what the GI Bill allowed. This is understanding policy, laws. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. Okay? So when I hear people tell African Americans, well, if you just try harder, you'll be successful. Well, let's back up. Let's look at some history here. If hard work was the common denominator for success in America, then African Americans will be the most successful people in the history of this country. Because who worked harder than the slave for 246 years? Who worked harder than the sharecropper in Jim Crow, Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia? Who worked harder than the domestic? Who worked harder than the washerwoman? Who worked harder than somebody on the convict leasing system, and they were railroaded, not even supposed to be in the convict leasing system? So what people don't want to talk about, and many people unfortunately don't understand history. Okay, see, this is why you hear me talk about, and I did this on my show Sunday, this is why you hear me talk about this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center, Teaching Hard History American Slavery, Teaching Hard History American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which documents how this study, it's a free study, you can download it, you've heard me talk about it before. This study documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in schools all across the country, and the legacy of slavery is being incorrectly taught, going into Reconstruction, going into Jim Crow, World War I, World War II, the Great Migration, 1915 to 1970, all of that stuff, going into the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, if the only reason why African Americans needed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is because the rights that the U.S. Constitution said were already ours were being denied to us. Well, this is the legacy of slavery. Okay, so we have to understand all this. So when African Americans are talking about reparations, we're talking about repairing the damage that was done and repairing the damage from the legacy of slavery, the maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources. There were, if you look at the article, and there were a bunch of articles that I talked about. There were some articles I talked about Sunday night. There were more articles that I had, but I didn't have time to get to because I only have 2 hours on 9:10 a.m. the Superstation. Now I'm happy that I have 2 hours because it could be a whole lot worse. Okay, because you know there's a deficit of African American owned radio stations in the city of Detroit. So you got to do what you got to do. And some of you just heard that Radio 1 is selling 105.9. The hip hop, they're selling 105.9, the R&B station. That's going to be sold at the end of the year. And also, they're selling 107.5, the hip hop station. So there's gentrification of the airwaves taking place in Detroit. So we have to do what we have to do. But if we look at the article, for instance, from the New York Times, June 20th, 2019, Black people's land was stolen. Black people's land was stolen. Now this was written by Andrew Carl. I guess it's pronounced Carl, K-A-H-R-L. He says, any discussion of reparations must include how this happened, who did it, and the laws, policies, and practices that allowed it. So all this deals with laws, policies. Slavery was sanctioned by the U.S. Constitution. Go to loc.gov, Library of Congress website, read the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution continued the transatlantic slave trade for an additional 20 years. Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution laid the foundation for the fugitive slave laws. Okay, we know that the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, which did not state that black people were 3/5 of a human being. By the way, that's just this is a total misunderstanding of history and a misunderstanding of law. This gave an incentive to slave-holding states to have more slaves so they can get more representation when it came to seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. The Electoral College, created by the U.S. Constitution, signed September 17, 1787, gave more electoral votes to slave-holding states because it gave more votes when it came to determining the population. And the Electoral College, how many electoral votes a particular state has is based upon population. How is it calculated? You take the number of seats in the U.S. Senate that a particular state has. Each state has 2. You add to that the number of seats that a particular state has in the U.S. House of Representatives. That tells you how many seats that tells you how many electoral college votes a particular state has. So Michigan has 16. The state of California has the most in the union at this point at 66, is based upon population. All right. So if we look at 1800, when the year 1800, when Thomas Jefferson becomes president, Virginia was the California of his time. Virginia had the largest population. They had the largest electoral college, the largest number of electoral college votes, but that was based upon their slave population. They had 12 electoral college votes. So we have to understand this history and understand the law. And this, in the U.S. Constitution, sanctioned slavery. the enslavement of African people. So politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. So when African Americans are talking about reparations, we're talking about repairing the damage done by the legacy of slavery, not just 246 years of slavery where 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country were exploited largely for free. We're talking about the lasting legacy of slavery, the maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources. We're talking about the wealth gap where the median household net worth of a white family is $171,400 compared to $17,000 for the median household net worth of an African American family. Okay, it's because of these policies, historic policies, that cause this maldistribution of wealth, power, and resources. When we look at land, okay, you see, you've heard me talk about the Homestead Act, and Dr. Julianne Malveaux talked about this as well. Well, you had hundreds of millions of acres of land given away from 1862 and on because of the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave away about 245 million acres of land for over 100 years. The last land giveaway was 80 acres of land in Alaska. That was given away in 1988. From 1862 to 1988, the U.S. government is giving away over about 245 million acres of land. You have taxpayer dollars funding this. You have taxpayers who are funding this who weren't alive during the Civil War, but they're still giving away land largely to white people. And African Americans are largely being excluded from this land giveaway after we worked the land for free for 246 years. So what we're dealing with, this is why we have to understand a chronology of history, okay? What we're dealing with is the lasting legacy of slavery. So when we talk about this history, this is not an attack on anyone. This is not, you know, and I talked about this on my show Sunday night because 9:10 a.m., the superstation WFDF in Detroit, we have a diverse listening audience. It's not just African Americans who listen. And we have, you know, this would be on 8 different podcast platforms. We have people of different ethnicities that watch the videos on the African History Network and my YouTube channel, Michael Imhotep. So people come to these conversations with various levels of understanding of history based upon their personal experiences. Okay? Americans in general are ignorant of history. And this is one of the things that this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center talks about. If you read Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2014 expose in the Atlantic, The Case for Reparations, and here's the actual magazine. It's online, you can read it, but when it came out, I bought the magazine. I talked about it on my show because I read his expose, 17-page expose, his article, man. This thing was deep. You could tell Ta-Nehisi Coates did his research on this. That's why he was testifying at the H.R.40 hearing. Okay, he was qualified to testify. Now, these black people that the Republicans went and got, Burgess Owens, the former football player from the 1970s, I don't know why he was there. And then Colin Hodges, okay, I don't know why he was there. Okay, you saw they had some people who were unqualified. And they had the Democrats had Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who's an economist, who has a PhD in economics. The sister knows what she's talking about. And once again, I firmly believe that if Dr. Julianne Malveaux had been a man, she would have gotten more questions, because she got to the point, she said, you know, I'm frustrated that economic questions are being directed to non-economists. I really think that a lot of people did not believe that this black woman had a PhD in economics. She's actually an economist. Because, you know, when you watch MSNBC, I was just watching MSNBC. Well, it's on right now, muted. But I was just watching MSNBC, and on Ali Velshi's show, you know, he had an economist on. Well, it was a white male, or older white male. Usually, when you watch CNN, MSNBC, I don't know why you'd be watching Fox News, but okay. Usually when you see economists, these are usually older white males. You usually don't see African-American female economists, even though they do exist. All right? So I'm glad our sister, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, was there. But back to this article here from the New York Times from June 20th, 2019. Black people's land was stolen. in the article, one of the things he says is that in the decades after the end of Reconstruction, Reconstruction is from 1865 to 1877, as the nation abandoned its black citizens and the South descended into the age of Jim Crow, African Americans succeeded against all odds in acquiring a remarkable amount of land. By 1910, black people claimed ownership of nearly 16 million acres of land in 1910. Okay, they did so in spite of the constant threat of forced dispossession at the hands of white mobs and officials. Sometimes black property owners faced sudden and violent attacks, such as the racial cleansing of Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912, and the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Okay, so they're talking about how African Americans lost land. And from 1920 to 1975, African Americans lost about 14 million acres of land. 14 million acres of land. And the wealth is tied into the land. So when we talk about reparations and we talk about policies, we also have to talk about land dispossession that was historic, that took place dealing with African Americans. And it was violence inflicted, but it was also legal means like the heirs rights, which is a legal loophole which allowed this land to be sold right from underneath our feet. Read the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. I talked about this before when I dealt with African American soybean growers who filed a lawsuit against the Stein Seed Company because they alleged they were sold fake soybean seeds, and they said this is an attempt. They said this is an attempt to steal our land. Okay, and there's a history of African Americans' land and farmers' land being stolen from us. All right, in 1920 you had about 925,000 African American farmers, and then from about 1920, 1960, 1975, we're going to lose over somewhere around 600,000. We lose actually more than 600,000 farmers. Okay. And one of the ways that those farms were lost is that during the Great Depression, you had the Farmers Home Administration, which made low-interest loans to white farmers so they can pay the mortgages on their farms and mechanize their farms. And African American farmers were largely discriminated against when it came to these loans, and many of us, actually hundreds of thousands of us, lost our farms. Just from 1930 to 1939, you have over 200,000 farms that are lost. Just from that period of time, 1930 to 1939. They talk about this in the book, How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy. But read the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com called From 15 Million Acres of Land to 1 million, how black people lost their land. This is from June 30th, 2017 by David A. Love. You've heard me talk about this before. From 15 million acres of land to 1 million, how black people lost their land. Okay, but all of this deals with a chronology of history and a legacy of slavery. Okay, we can't get away from this. All right, this ties into the wealth gap. This ties into the lack of African American home ownership. And then also, I talked about this on my show Sunday. If we look at the study that came from the Brookings Institute, and there were a number of articles written about this. Ebony.com had an article dealing with this as well. But African American home ownership, the African American home ownership value is $156 billion less than that of white home ownership value. Okay, and this is tied to also tied into a wealth disparity also. Okay, let me try to pull up that article because Ebony.com has an article dealing with this, and also Curbed.com. Okay, and we'll pull that up. And then Black America Web had an article that picked up on the USA Today study, with the big article from USA Today that talked about how the reverse mortgage trend is disproportionately stripping African American families of wealth because they're losing their homes, getting caught up in the reverse mortgage trend. Melody Hobson talked about this on the Tom Joyner Morning Show on blackamericaweb.com, has an article talking about this also. Okay, so I mean, this stuff is real, And what we see is that oftentimes African Americans are targeted when it came to some subprime mortgages, targeted when it comes to the reverse mortgages. This is real, and it all ties into our wealth or lack of wealth. Okay, let's see, curbed.com, C-U-R-B-E-D, curb.com has the article, How a Segregation Tax is Costing Black American Homeowners $156 billion. How a segregation tax is costing Black American homeowners $156 billion. MSNBC talked about this. They had stories. Ali Velshi covered this. Ebony.com has an article. But this was a study from the Brookings Institution and Gallup study, okay, that dealt with this. According to the devaluation of assets in black neighborhoods, the case of residential property, owner-occupied homes are undervalued by the real estate market across all majority black neighborhoods and consistently sell or are appraised for lower prices at an average of $48,000 per home in a lost value. Nationwide, this amounts to $156 billion in cumulative losses, what the report dubs a segregation tax. But people want to tell African Americans, just try harder. Just try harder. Well, when you study history, no, it was the federal government that helped create a lot of these issues, and it was the federal government that provided aid for certain people and discriminated against African Americans. Okay, so when we talk about reparations, it was the federal government that created the problem. It's going to be through public policy. It's going to be the federal government that corrects the problem, repairs the damage through public policy. This is what this is about. This is not asking for a handout. All right. Okay. So we'll post a link here to this article here also from curbed.com. And somebody's sending me a message through Facebook while I'm trying to broadcast live. I don't know why the hell they're doing this, but anyway. All right. Let's see. Turn that off. All right. I have to get to that later. All right. How's everybody doing? If you like this type of information, also, you could donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. This helps us to keep doing the research, stay on the air, finance our Sunday night show, and you can also order our DVD lectures. I have 3 new ones. This is the 3-hour presentation I did dealing with the history of Juneteenth. We'll post the links here. This is at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Juneteenth history, Emancipation Day, but not Independence Day. We never got our 40 acres and a mule. Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign. We're coming to get our check. This is I could get deep into the history. Then also we have, let me see, what's the other one? I did 3 recently. This is from February 23rd, 2019. Black Migration, 1619 to 2019, from the birth of a nation to the Red Summer of 1919, the Great Migration, Detroit Race Riot in 1943. There was a lot of history here as well. This was during African American History Month. I did this. And May 11th, I did this presentation, Ancient Africans in America, Before Native Americans, Before Columbus or Slavery, from Kemet to Wakanda. Okay, so this is all available at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All right, we have on Facebook here, we have who we have, Rhonda, Gunjaman, Trina, just a few of the people watching, Latasha, and then on, let's see, on YouTube, we have Arlene, Christopher, Trey, just a few of the people watching on YouTube. How's everybody doing? Okay. And African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Email us at customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. Customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network also. Okay. Our current promotion is get 2 months for the price of 1. All right, so let's continue here. All this history is interconnected, interrelated. All right, and this is why it's important to understand the chronology of history. And one of the things I noticed at the hearing, the H.R.40 hearing, is the black people, the Republicans put up, were talking about their feelings, whereas Ta-Nehisi Coates and Dr. Julianne Malveaux are dealing with the science. They're actually dealing with the history. They're dealing with the statistics. All right, and this is how you have to do battle. You have to do battle with the facts and evidence, not feelings and emotions. All right, we have to do battle with the facts and evidence, not feelings and emotions. Okay, let's continue here. So if we go back to the original article from History.com, official website of the History Channel, dealing with not H.R.40, but dealing with the GI Bill, okay? Dealing with the GI Bill. And also in How White Folks Got So Rich, The Untold Story of American White Supremacy, they talk about the GI Bill as well, okay? And I may share an excerpt of that with you also. And when we have these conversations, once again, you know, I know different social media platforms have changed their policies dealing with hate speech. This is not hate speech. We're dealing with history, okay? This is not hate speech. We're dealing with history. Unfortunately, oftentimes people want to attack us when we actually deal with the history and tell the truth. I wonder why. I haven't figured that out yet. Now, so the GI Bill became one of the major forces that drove an economic expansion in America that lasted 30 years after World War II. So we're going from 1945 to 1975. Only 20% of the money set aside for unemployment compensation under the GI Bill was given out, as most veterans found jobs or pursued higher education. Low-interest home loans enabled millions of American families to move out of urban centers and buy or build homes outside the city. These are called suburbs. They don't want to tell you, and they say changing the face of the suburbs. These are suburbs, okay? And then you have the U.S. Interstate Highway Acts of 1952 and 1956 that were lobbied for by the auto industry, lobbied for by the Big Three, used government money to build these U.S. interstate highways that drove 41,000 miles of U.S. interstate highways throughout the country. They ran through the African American community, wiping out tens of thousands of our businesses and our homes. And what really people don't want to talk about is that this construction of the highways created thousands of jobs for white men to build the highways, paid for by government money, paid for by taxpayer money, paid for by taxpayer dollars. Right? So when you talk about try harder, you're talking to the wrong people. I mean, study the history. When you talk about try harder, what are you talking about? So over 50 years, the impact of the GI Bill was enormous, with 20 million veterans and dependents using the education benefits and 14 million home loans guaranteed. 20 million veterans and their dependents using the education benefits from the GI Bill and 14 million home loans guaranteed, for a total federal investment of $67 billion. Well, you got people paying taxes that went to this $67 billion, and they, one, didn't benefit from it. Two, they were paying taxes after World War II ended. You had some people who were paying taxes that weren't even born when World War II ended, but their taxpayer dollars are still being used to finance the GI Bill. Among the millions of Americans who have taken advantage of the bill are former Presidents George H.W. Bush, the father, and Gerald Ford, former Vice President Al Gore, and entertainers Johnny Cash, Ed McMahon, Paul Newman, and Clint Eastwood. They all took advantage of the GI Bill. So this is an article from History.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. FDR signs GI Bill. FDR signs GI Bill, June 22nd, 1944. So just 3 days after the H.R.40 reparations hearing, we were also commemorating the anniversary of Franklin Roosevelt signing the GI Bill into law, okay? But then History.com had another article. Now this article was written by Aaron Blakemore. And this article was sent out like the same day, and they posted it on their Facebook page. This article came out the same day that they were commemorating the signing of the GI Bill. This article deals with how the GI Bill's promise was denied to 1 million Black World War II veterans. Because see, in the article dealing with FDR science, the GI Bill, they didn't talk about the impact it had on African Americans, how we were discriminated against. I find it interesting they left that out, but okay. Anyway, but at least Aaron Blakemore wrote this article, because this article really gets into it. So the sweeping bill promised prosperity to veterans, so why didn't Black Americans benefit? Now, when Eugene Burnett saw the neat tract houses of Levittown, New York, he knew he wanted to buy one. It was 1949. Now, 1949 is the same year that that you have the Federal Housing Act of 1949 that allows white people to put low interest, to put 3% down to get low interest loans to buy homes in the newly formed suburbs. All right, and there's an article from InTheseTimes.com, which ties into the history of Detroit, and it's called "Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership." Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership. It's called Detroit's Downfall. Detroit's Downfall: Beyond the Myth of Black Misleadership, and it's written by Marilyn Katz. And Marilyn Katz talks about how all these policies, government policies, were used to harm Detroit and African Americans in Detroit. Okay, it's a very, very interesting article, because people wanted to blame Coleman Young and blame Kwame and all this stuff. They didn't want to deal with the federal policies that negatively impacted Detroit, and they didn't want to deal with the deindustrialization of the inner cities that were taking place all across the country. This was orchestrated, the deindustrialization of the inner cities. So it was 1949, and Eugene Burnett was ready to settle down in a larger home with his family. So this is 4 years after World War II ends. The newly established Long Island suburb seemed like the perfect place to begin their post-war life. One that he hoped would be improved with the help of the GI Bill, a piece of sweeping legislation aimed at helping World War II veterans like Eugene Burnett prosper after the war. But when he spoke with a salesman about buying the house using a GI Bill guaranteed mortgage, the door to suburban life in Levittown, New York, slammed firmly in his face. The suburb was not open to African Americans. And see, you also had what were known as sundown towns. And sundown towns were towns where you knew if you were black, you had to be out by sundown, or you could be attacked by bigots, you could be arrested, things like this. You could be harassed. So these were called sundown towns, all right? And if we look at page 47 of this book, just very quickly here, it talks about sundown towns. Literally, this is the second edition. The third edition is in my backpack because I took it to the radio station last night. Literally hundreds of American towns, many of them in the North, passed ordinances prohibiting African Americans from living in them or from being in the town after sundown. Maids, gardeners, and sanitation workers were given time to leave at night. They came to be known as sundown towns, and some of them actually had bells or horns that would signal when blacks were to vacate. The largest builder of these segregated towns in the post-World War II era was William Levitt, L-E-V-I-T-T, who built 4 massive towns and forbade the very presence of, quote, any person other than members of the Caucasian race, end quote. This is all dealing with laws and policies. One young black family that was able to surreptitiously purchase, that means covertly, okay, purchase a home in Levittown was subjected to a months-long terror campaign to drive them out. White people burned crosses, smashed windows, and persecuted the African Americans around the clock. Republican pundit Bill O'Reilly was raised in Levittown, Long Island. This is the Levittown we're talking about. right here that Eugene Burnett tried to buy a home in using the guaranteed mortgage loan from the GI Bill, because he was a World War II veteran. Now, builders like William Levitt and many others worked with discriminatory realtors and banks to ensure only whites could invest in prime real estate. This artificially increased white homeowners' wealth as property values rose exponentially after World War II. So this had helped them to accumulate wealth, dealing with the inflated value in their homes that we were largely excluded, who the hell is calling? Largely excluded from buying, okay? Largely excluded from buying. Now, this artificially increased white homeowners' wealth as property values rose exponentially after World War II, and the equity in their homes allowed them to help their children secure property. Today, more than 3/4 of white families own a home, and 46% of them had help from their families in making down payments, compared to just 12% of African Americans. Now, this was at the time this book came out. This second edition came out in 2014, but it's still pretty accurate, okay? Levittown was named after William Levitt, if I remember correctly. Okay, but this deals with the sundown towns tied into these laws excluding African Americans from living in these towns. Okay, so let's go back to the article from History.com, how the GI Bill's promise was denied to 1 million Black World War II veterans. Okay. And everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page, on your YouTube channel. This is some deep history that we're getting into, okay? And also we'll post a link to the new lecture that I talked about as well, dealing with the history of Juneteenth. We'll put that here on the thread of the broadcast also, okay? All right, how's everybody doing? We got Quentin, we got John Ray. Visit his website, workingwithjohnray.com. We've got Trey on YouTube. Lemmy, Christopher, just a few of the people watching on YouTube and Facebook. All right. Okay, let's continue here. All right. So now, when Burnett spoke with when Eugene Burnett spoke with the salesman about buying the house in Levittown, New York, using a GI Bill guaranteed mortgage, the door to suburban life in Levittown slammed firmly in his face. The suburb was not open to African Americans. His wife Bernice said, quote, it was as though it wasn't real. Look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin that I can't be part of it, end quote. Now, the Burnetts were not the only African Americans for whom the promise of the GI Bill turned out to be an illusion, okay? Though the bill helped white Americans prosper and accumulate wealth in the post-war years, it did not deliver on that promise for veterans of color, specifically African Americans, okay? I don't know why they just didn't say black people. Yeah, veterans of color, but the majority of the people you're talking about are African Americans. Now, in fact, the widespread disparity in the bill's implementation ended up helping driving growing gaps in wealth, education, and civil rights between white and black Americans. So this is created by the government. The GI Bill was from the government. The GI Bill helped to exacerbate the wealth disparities between African Americans and white families. So if you're dealing with government policy that helped to create this problem and help to exacerbate the problem, then it's going to be government policy that solves the problem. Okay, the solution to this is not economic empowerment for African Americans. The solution, I'm all for economic empowerment. I'm all for investing in the stock market. I'm all for us having more businesses and things like this. But that's not how this problem existed. The problem existed from government policy. So if it was government policy that created the problem, it's going to be government policy that solves the problem. telling African Americans to try harder and own more businesses and all this don't solve that problem. Because that's not what created it. They're trying to distract you and send you off in another direction and not address the systemic racism that created this problem in the first place. Now, my degree's in business administration. I'm all for us owning more businesses. We went from 1.9 million African American owned businesses in 2007 to about 4 million black owned businesses in 2019. And 95% of them don't have any employees. They're largely undercapitalized. Okay? So I'm all for this, but I ain't for playing games with our people. We need to tell the truth about what caused this. Now, while the GI Bill's language did not specifically exclude African American veterans from its benefits, it was structured in a way that ultimately shut doors for the 1.2 million black veterans who had bravely served their country during World War II in segregated ranks. 1.2 million African American veterans, African American soldiers served in World War II, and they're largely excluded from this GI Bill that their taxpayer dollars are paying for, creating opportunities for white GIs. So all this came about from the fear of the advancement of African Americans. Here's what happened. This is how politics legally distribute. This is how politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources. Now, when lawmakers began drafting the GI Bill in 1944, some Southern Democrats, also known as Dixiecrats, some Southern Democrats feared that returning World War II veterans would use public sympathy for veterans to advocate against Jim Crow laws. How dare them? Now, see, you got to understand, during World War II, there was a double V campaign that African American soldiers were involved in. And this was created by black newspapers. I think it was the Pittsburgh Courier that talked about this, that created this double V campaign. It was victory abroad, fighting against the Nazis, fighting against Hitler, okay? It's victory abroad, and victory at home, fighting against Jim Crow segregation, fighting to get full class citizenship, fighting against racism at home. They had a double V campaign. During World War II, you had a huge race riot that broke out in Detroit. In June of 1943, you had the Detroit race riot of 1943 that broke out. Okay? So while African American men are serving abroad and then fighting for their country, you got their families dealing with segregation, and you have other African Americans dealing with segregation here in this country, dealing with segregation, the Ku Klux Klan. So when they come back home, they say, look, we're not dealing with the same segregation. We want all of our rights right now. We want first-class citizenship. And they're fighting to break down the walls of segregation, which is going to lead to what we know as the modern-day civil rights movement, starting with the Montgomery bus boycott, which started the Monday morning, December 5th, 1955. Okay? After Brown versus Board of Education desegregation case, that ruling May of 1954. You have the desegregation of the armed forces in 1947, 2 years after World War II ends. You have the Democratic Party, who's going to have a more pro-civil rights agenda during the 1948 presidential campaign. And you're going to have Strom Thurmond, who was a segregationist Dixiecrat, segregationist Southern Democrat, who's going to run on the platform of segregation. He runs as a Dixiecrat in 1947-48. And then Strom Thurmond, because of things like the Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, he's going to end up leaving the Democratic Party. And where did Strom Thurmond go? He went to the Republican Party, where a lot of the Southern Dixiecrats went after the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, Executive Order 11246, which was known as affirmative action, September 1965. A lot of them are going to go to the Republican Party, where they're going to end up staying, and that mentality largely persists now. Okay? See, this is what a lot of people don't want to talk about. When they had the hearing and you had Representative Gomer of Texas, talking about history of the Democrats, he don't want to tell you where those Southern segregationists went. See, they don't want to have that conversation, right? When you had Burgess Owens talking about the Democratic Party created the Ku Klux Klan. No, they didn't. It was people who were Democrats who created the Ku Klux Klan, December 24th, 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. It wasn't the Democratic Party that created the Klan. But he didn't want to talk about the Southern strategy. He didn't want to talk about the Lily White movement created by Republicans in 1928 to get Herbert Hoover elected, who was running against a Northern Democrat named Al Smith, and they implemented a 5-state Southern strategy to lure Southern segregationist Democrats to vote for the Republican Party. And Herbert Hoover win. They don't want to have this conversation. I find it very interesting. Why? I find it very interesting how Republicans don't want to talk about this. The Lily White movement of 1928, which pushed African Americans out of the Republican Party, and they go to the Democratic Party because this was a movement to ignore the issues and the conditions of African Americans, especially ignore the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which was rejuvenated by the movie The Birth of a Nation in 1915. And African Americans are trying to get their issues addressed by the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and the Lily White movement is pushing them out and turning a blind eye. Turn the blind eye to them and a deaf ear to lure more Southern Democrats into the Republican Party and appeal to the Southern segregationists. They don't want to have this conversation. See, I should have been on that panel because I would have wore their behinds out. A lot of this information is on their own website, house.gov. I know because I've done the research. A lot of this information talking about the party realignment comes from house.gov, which is the official website of the House of Representatives. So how is a Representative Gomer, a Texas Republican, don't want to deal with this? And this is on your own website. So if we're going to deal with the history, we need to deal with it correctly. Jay Marie said, come on, Michael, bring it all the way to the present time. Still in slavery. No, I'm not still in slavery. What are you talking about? But many of us still have a slave mentality. Okay, so I don't know if it's stopped broadcasting on YouTube or Facebook or what, but hey, we're still going on YouTube, so we're going to keep going. All right. I'm using Crowdcast. Usually I was using Zoom, right? But I'm using Crowdcast to broadcast on Facebook and YouTube at the same time, okay? Okay, so let's continue. All right, so fear of African American advancement. Imagine that some of the same people that tell you to try harder were the ones writing laws to make it harder for you to achieve the American dream. Now, when lawmakers began drafting the GI Bill in 1944, some Southern Democrats feared that returning World War II veterans would use public sympathy for veterans to advocate for Jim Crow laws. To make sure the GI Bill largely benefited white people, the Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, drew on tactics that had previously been used to ensure that the New Deal helped as few black people as possible. Now, some of the policies are going to help more African Americans than others, but largely these policies are going to discriminate against African Americans. Not because originally they were designed to do this, but it was the way that the resources were distributed. They were largely distributed at the state level as opposed from the federal level. Here's an example how this happened. During the drafting of the law, the chair of the House Veterans Committee, Mississippi Congressman John Rankin, R-A-N-K-I-N, remember that name, segregationist, Democrat, Southern Democrat, Dixiecrat. So at this time, you have the Northern Democrats who in general were more liberal, but not always, but in general more liberal. The Northern Democrats, then you had the Southern segregationist Democrats, also known as the Dixiecrats. Okay, so Mississippi Congressman John Rankin played hardball and insisted that the program be administered by individual states instead of the federal government. Individual states instead of the federal government. He got his way. Mississippi Congressman John Rankin was known for his virulent racism. He defended segregation, opposed interracial marriage, and had even proposed legislation to confine, then deport every person with Japanese heritage during World War II. We know that the Japanese were paid reparations because of being put in detention camps, okay? And if you read the article, New York Times had a number of good articles dealing with this. And one of the really good things about the H.R.40 reparations hearing, even though, you know, they should have had more, I think, historians and things like this, and, you know, this person wasn't there, that person wasn't there. There have been dozens of articles written about the hearing and written about this history surrounding this topic, digging deep into this history, and more people are becoming educated on this issue. New York Times had an article June 19, 2019. America has tried reparations before. Here's how it went. America has tried reparations before. Here's how it went. So it talked about, you know, Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II, survivors of police abuses in Chicago, victims of forced sterilization in North Carolina, all paid reparations. But they talked about World War II, defining the wrong done to Japanese Americans was fairly straightforward, okay? And they talk about the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948. Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948 offered compensation for real and personal property that Japanese Americans lost. About $37 million was paid to 26,000 claimants, but no provision was made for lost freedom or violated rights. Now that's going to come in 1988. 1988, when Congress voted to extend an apology and pay $20,000 to each Japanese American survivor of the internment that took place during World War II. More than $1.6 billion was paid to 82,219 eligible claimants. Now, this was in 1988. This came from taxpayer dollars. So you had taxpayers in the 1980s whose taxpayer dollars went to pay reparations for what happened during 1941, 42, things like this. But some of the people paying taxes weren't even born when Japanese were put in internment camps, but yet their taxpayer dollars still paid for this. But there weren't no mass protests against this. I wonder why. But there weren't no a lot of the people who were, I mean, some of the same people who are against reparations, some of the same people in Congress who are against reparations or even having a hearing to discuss this, to form a committee. Some of those same people weren't against these reparations paid out to Japanese Americans. So I just find it interesting when they come up with these little arguments, when there's a history of them paying out reparations, at least trying to do the right thing for all these other people. I can't put my finger on what's wrong with this. I can't figure it out. Read this article. This is an extensive article from New York Times by Adil Hassan and Jack Healy. America has tried reparations before. Here's how it went. Okay, we'll post a link here on the thread of our broadcast also for this. And it says, with a renewed focus on reparations for slavery, what lessons can be drawn from payments to victims of other historical injustices in America? You paying reparations. You got people whose taxpayer dollars in 1988 are paying for what happened decades before, and some of them weren't even born when it happened. Some of them didn't even know any Japanese. Imagine that. I bet you they like Japanese food, though. You know. All right, let's continue. How's everybody doing on YouTube? I don't know if we're still on Facebook or what, but, you know, whatever. Okay, so Mississippi Congressman John Rankin was known for his virulent racism. He defended segregation, opposed interracial marriage, and even proposed legislation to confine, then deport every person with Japanese heritage during World War II. All right. Now, when the bill came to a committee vote, he was stonewalled in an attempt to gut another provision that entitled all veterans to $20 a week of unemployment compensation for a year. Okay. Now, Mississippi Congressman John Rankin knew this would represent a significant gain for black Southerners, so he refused to cast a critical proxy vote in protest. The American Legion ended up tracking down the congressman who had left his proxy vote with John Rankin and flying him to Washington to break the deadlock. Okay, now that $20 a week unemployment compensation for a year, that would have helped a whole lot of white men down in Mississippi. But John Rankin had such a hatred that it could benefit some African Americans, he was willing to sacrifice some of his own people to keep these resources from African Americans. Politics is the legal distribution of scarce wealth, power, and resources, and the writing of laws, statutes, ordinances, amendments, and treaties, their adoption, interpretation, and enforcement. And is largely the legal distribution based upon race. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism doesn't have anything to do with not liking people, calling people racial epithets, okay? Even though that could be part of it, racism is a power structure. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. And we see an example with this here with Governor Rankin and this policy, this bill, this law that was going to distribute wealth and resources largely based upon race. Okay. Also, if you like this type of information, you can donate to the African History Network, paypal.me/the AHN show, paypal.me/the AHN show. We'll post the link here on the thread. And then be sure to register for the online course that I'm teaching, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. And this is an 8-week, 16-hour online course. We do it live Wednesday nights, 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. All the sessions are recorded. You can go back and watch it over and over again if you miss anything. There's also about 36 hours of bonus content, including the previous class I did, full class I did in September 2017. Okay, so that online course is $80. As soon as you register, you can watch the bonus content. You can watch session 1, and you'll be ready for session 2 Wednesday, June 26th. Okay, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. All right, so let's continue here. And this is freezing up. I don't know why. Okay, here we go. We'll try to post this here. How's everybody doing on YouTube? All right. So, President Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act into law on June 22nd, 1944, also known as the GI Bill. All right. And this was only weeks after the D-Day offensive began, which was June 6, 1944. So it ushered into law sweeping benefits for veterans, including college tuition, low-cost home loans, and unemployment insurance as well. All right. But this is largely going to discriminate against African Americans. So the GI Bill's effect on black veterans, what was that? From the start, black veterans had trouble securing the GI Bill's benefits. Okay, some could not access benefits. Some could not access benefits because they had not been given an honorable discharge, okay, from the military, and a much larger number of African American veterans were discharged dishonorably than their white counterparts. A lot of that had to do with racism and things we were facing during World War II. Okay, the discrimination we were facing, and also when you read about African American soldiers looking after the Nazi prisoners, they talked about how the Nazi prisoners were treated better than the African American soldiers. Okay. And there were stories that were written about that during the commemoration also of 75th commemoration of D-Day. All right, now veterans who did not qualify could not find facilities that delivered on the GI Bill's promise. Black veterans in a vocational training program at a segregated high school in Indianapolis were unable to participate in activities related to plumbing, electricity, and printing because adequate equipment was only available to white students. So what you're doing is you are allocating these resources to be able to teach these classes that they can get the funding to take. You are allocating the resources based upon race as well. And oftentimes what happened was a lot of these African American GIs were directed into the classes dealing with the trades as opposed to directed towards college. All right, now, simple intimidation kept others from enjoying GI Bill benefits. In 1947, for example, a crowd hurled rocks at African American veterans as they moved into a Chicago housing development. Thousands of black veterans were attacked in the years following World War II, and some were singled out and lynched. And we know that happened a lot in after World War I. The year after World War I is called the Red Summer. 1919 is called the Red Summer. You had over 25 major race riots all across the country. And you had cases where you had African American soldiers who were lynched in their uniforms. All right? But it was called the Red Summer. James Weldon Johnson, who wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing, which became the Black National Anthem, he called it the Red Summer because the streets of America were flowing with blood. This is why it's called the Red Summer. And these African American men are coming back after World War I. You had what was called the New Negro. And you had these brothers who had a new sense of pride, new sense of dignity, and they were fighting for full first-class citizenship. They wanted all their rights now, okay? And they were saying they weren't dealing with the same segregation that they were dealing with before they went and fought in the war. They were fighting to break down the walls of segregation then. We saw the same thing happening after World War II. All right, so thousands of African American veterans were attacked in the years following World War II, and some were singled out and lynched. Now, though Congressman John Rankin of Mississippi had lost the battle to exclude African American men from VA Veterans Affairs unemployment insurance, it was doled out inequitably. Okay, men who applied for unemployment benefits were kicked out of the program if any other work was available to them, even work that provided less than subsistence wages. Okay, subsistence wages. Southern postmasters were even accused of refusing to deliver the forms black veterans needed to fill out to receive their unemployment benefits. African American veterans and civil rights groups protested their treatment, calling for protections like black involvement in the VA and non-discriminatory loans. Keep in mind, their taxpayer dollars and African Americans' taxpayer dollars are paying for all these policies that we're largely being discriminated against, taking advantage of. Okay, so black involvement in the VA and non-discriminatory loans, but the racial disparities in the implementation of the GI Bill had already been set into motion. As the years went on, white veterans flowed into newly created suburbs. The suburbs were created by the government. They're using the Federal Housing Act of 1949 to get low interest loans to build these houses in the suburbs. I'm not talking about veterans, I'm talking about anybody, white people. Okay? That's government policy, the Federal Housing Act of 1949. But they're using the redlining system created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation of 1933. They're using this to mark the homes in the suburbs, grade them as A, and grade and shade them as green, which means these are good investments and it's safe to make loans in these areas. But homes in the African American community got the grade of D, and they were outlined with red to say these are high risk areas, don't make loans here. So you're going to have the insurance companies and the realtors who use the redlining system that was created by the federal government. There's an article from blackpass.org, blackpass.org, called Redlining, 1937 to present. redlining, which deals with this history. Okay, the origin of the term redlining stems from the policies developed by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created in 1933 by President Franklin Roosevelt, by the Franklin Roosevelt administration, to reduce home foreclosures during the Great Depression, and then institutionalized by the 1937 U.S. Housing Act, which established the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. Federal housing agencies, including the HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, and the Federal Housing Association, determined whether areas were deemed unfit for investment by banks, insurance companies, savings and loan associations, and other financial services companies. The areas were physically demarcated with red shading on a map. In contrast, zones which were to receive preferential lending status were marked in green shading, and intermediate areas in blue shading. Often, these decisions were arbitrarily based on the area's racial composition rather than income levels. Racial composition rather than income levels. So it means areas where lower class, lower socioeconomic white people live, it's going to have a higher rating as well, those areas for investment. While the practice was almost universal before 1968, the Civil Rights Act passed that year theoretically outlawed redlining. So they're referring to the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Nonetheless, its impact was felt long after that date. In a series of Pulitzer Prize winning articles which appeared in 1988 under the title The Color of Money, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reporter Bill Dedman, D-E-D-M-E-N, described how Atlanta, Georgia banks still discriminated by the racial designation of neighborhoods. This is 1988, 20 years after the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was signed into law by President Roosevelt. President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson. His article illustrated how these banks were nearly twice as likely to lend to homeowners and prospective home buyers in low-income white neighborhoods as in affluent black areas. Let me repeat this. His article illustrated how these banks were nearly twice as likely to lend to homeowners and prospective buyers in low-income white neighborhoods as opposed to as in affluent black areas. Okay. Now, if you look at Ta-Nehisi Coates' article from The Atlantic, June 2014 issue of The Atlantic, called "The Case for Reparations," right? In here, he focuses on the housing disparities, okay, and how the laws allow white people who get these loans to accumulate wealth. And he talks about how black families making $100,000 a year typically live in the kinds of neighborhoods inhabited by white families making $30,000 a year. And all this deals with the redlining, and it deals with the investments that are made into these communities. This comes from federal policy. All right. Okay, so let's go back to the article from, let's go back to the one from dealing with the black GIs, okay? All right, now, so we have black veterans and civil rights groups protested their treatment, calling for protection like black involvement in the VA and non-discriminatory loans, okay? Now, but black veterans lacked those. So as the years went on, white veterans flowed into newly created suburbs where they began amassing wealth in skilled positions. But black veterans lacked those options. The majority of skilled jobs were given to white workers. So a white post-war housing boom and redlining in black neighborhoods. The post-war housing boom almost entirely excluded African Americans, most of whom remained in cities that received less and less investment from businesses and banks. Though the GI Bill guaranteed low interest mortgages and other loans, they were not administered by the Veterans Affairs, by the Veterans Administration itself. Thus, the VA could co-sign but not actually guarantee the loans. The VA could co-sign but not actually guarantee the loans. This gave white-ran financial institutions free rein to refuse mortgages and loans to African Americans. Redlining, a decades-old practice of marking maps by race to characterize the risk of lending money and providing insurance, made purchasing a home even more difficult for African American veterans. After they went and served their country, risked their lives, things like this. Okay? Lenders froze out poor neighborhoods, ensuring that loan assistance and insurance would be denied. And new white suburbs often came with overtly racist covenants, restrictive covenants, that denied entry to black people. So restrictive covenants meant it was written in their it was written in the deeds that white people had for their homes. It was written in their deeds that the home could not be sold to non-white people, especially African Americans. Okay, so this kept these neighborhoods largely white only and locked African Americans out from getting homes in these neighborhoods and having their wealth accumulate because of the rising value of these homes. Okay, these are all government policies or allowed to happen and continue and be ignored by the government. All right, now in 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black borrowers. Let me repeat that. In 1947, 2 years after World War II ends, in 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA guaranteed home loans in 13 Mississippi cities went to black borrowers. Quote, these impediments were not confined to the South, notes historian Ira Katznelson. Okay, quote, in New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer in New York and the northern New Jersey suburbs, fewer than 100 of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill supported home purchases by non-whites. Less than 100 out of 67,000 mortgages. And some of the very people who took advantage of this are some of the same people today telling African Americans to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and to try harder. These are some of the same people. Now, failure to receive GI Bill education benefits. What happened there? All right. And we're still on YouTube. How's that? Can y'all hear me okay and see me okay on YouTube? All right. Now, black veterans in search of the education they had been guaranteed fared no better. Many African American men returning home from the war did not even try to take advantage of the bill's educational benefits. Okay, they could not afford to spend time in school instead of working, and this is because of structural inequities. So their families have less accumulated wealth than white families have less accumulated wealth. So they didn't have a lot of time, oftentimes, to be able to go to school because they have to make some money right away. But those who did go to school or did pursue school were at a considerable disadvantage compared to their white counterparts. Public education provided poor preparation. Public education provided poor preparation for African American students, and many of them lacked much educational attainment at all due to poverty and social pressures. Social pressures like you have to eat. So you got to have money to eat. As veteran applications flooded universities, African American students often found themselves left out. Northern universities dragged their feet when it came to admitting black students. And Southern colleges barred African American students entirely. And the VA itself encouraged black veterans to apply for vocational training instead of university admission, and arbitrarily denied educational benefits to some students. Now keep in mind, the African American veterans trying to take advantage of this. Keep in mind their taxpayer dollars are paying for these programs that they're being excluded from taking advantage of, and their service in the military guarantees they should be able to take advantage of these programs. Taxpayer dollars by African Americans are paying for these programs that African Americans are largely being discriminated from being able to take advantage of. As veteran applications flooded universities, black students often found themselves left out. All right. Now, those students who did try to attend college anyway found doors closed at every turn. A full 95% of African American veterans were shunned off to a full 95% of African American veterans were shunted off to black colleges, institutions that were underfunded and overwhelmed by the influx of new students. Most were accredited, most were unaccredited, and with a massive influx in applicants, they had to turn away tens of thousands of veterans. Now, they talk about the GI Bill also in How White Folks Got So Rich. They talk about the GI Bill here as well, and they echo the History.com. On page 75 of the second edition, it says here, now it says, let me just see something, what the heck is going on here? It says it's waiting for me to reconnect. Okay, on page 75 of the second edition, it says from 1944 to 1971, $95 billion was spent on the GI Bill, officially titled the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And this was to help World War II veterans adjust to civilian life by assisting in their purchase of homes, the startup of businesses, startup of business ventures, and the acquisition of education. But various methods were used to discriminate against black veterans. Those blacks who could qualify for GI benefits were steered into menial jobs. In 1946, 86% of white veterans were referred to professional jobs, and 92% of black veterans were referred to unskilled service jobs. Refusing those jobs was grounds for denial of other benefits like unemployment insurance. So if the African American veterans refused menial jobs that were available, they could lose their unemployment insurance. Okay? To avoid using overtly racist language, the federal government put the operation of these programs in the hands of local governments. Put the operation of these programs in the hands of local governments. A ploy that enabled Southern segregationist officials to determine who would receive the benefits, just as they determined who could and could not vote. All right. So they go. So check this out, because they go deeper into this as well. But this is some. Now we ain't talking about 100 years ago. 1944. That's less than 100 years ago. There's only about 75 years ago that we're talking about that the GI Bill was signed into law. So this is fairly recent history. And they're talking about from 1944 to 1971. Hell, I was born in 71. Okay? 1944 to 1971, $95 billion was spent on the GI Bill of taxpayer dollars. Okay, so let's continue. Let's go back to the article from History.com. All right. So those students who did try to attend college anyway found doors closed at every turn. A full 95% of black veterans were shunted off to black colleges, institutions that were underfunded and overwhelmed by the influx of new students. Now, Most were unaccredited, and with a massive influx in applicants, they had to turn away tens of thousands of veterans. Quote, though Congress granted all soldiers the same benefits theoretically, writes historian Hillary Herbold, H.R.40. Quote, the segregationist principles of almost every institution of higher learning effectively disbarred a huge proportion of black veterans from earning a college degree. The segregationist principles of almost every institution of higher learning effectively disbarred a huge proportion of black veterans from earning a college degree, end quote. All right. So the GI Bill and the maldistribution of resources with the GI Bill helped to exacerbate the wealth gap that we talk about today. The original GI Bill ended in July 1956. By that time, nearly 8 million World War II veterans had received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion had been handed out. Okay, that's by 1956. Nearly 8 million World War II veterans had received education or training, and 4.3 million home loans worth $33 billion had been handed out. But most African American veterans had been left out of this. As employment, college attendance, and wealth surged for white Americans, disparities with their black counterparts not only continued but widened or increased. There was, writes Ira Katznelson, historian, quote, no greater instrument for widening an already huge racial gap in post-war America than the GI Bill. Now this is Ira Katznelson. Today, a stark wealth gap between African American and white Americans persists. The median wealth for white households is about $171,000. For African American households is just $17,100, about 1/10 that of their white counterparts. The legacy of the GI Bill is still at work, and for African American families, its negative impact could linger for years to come. Now, this is History.com, the official website of the History Channel, breaking this down. So when we saw our sister scholar, Dr. Julianne Malveaux, who I've interviewed before, and I need to interview her again. She has a PhD in economics. She's breaking down at the H.R.40 hearing, she's breaking down the impact of these policies and how they have negatively impacted generations of African Americans. Okay? So when we talk about reparations, we're talking about repairing this damage that was done largely by government programs, paid for by taxpayer dollars, including our taxpayer dollars. Okay, so, all right, but this is some deep history. So be sure also to register for the online course that I'm teaching, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. Visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We have the information there. You can register there. As soon as you register, you can start watching. There's 36 hours of bonus content. You can start watching dealing with history. The last time I taught this class live was September of 2017. That full class is there. You can watch that also. So the class is 8 weeks, 16 hours. We first couple of classes we're doing it on Wednesdays, and we'll probably switch to Saturdays. I think after that, or we may leave it Wednesdays. I'm not sure. But you can anything you miss, all the sessions are recorded, so you can go back and watch it over and over again. You can watch from around the world. Okay, we deal with thousands of years of history. We deal with the 800-year occupation of Europe by the Africans known as the Moors. We deal with ancient African history. We deal with ancient Kemet. We deal with the 3 great West African kingdoms, Ghana, Songhai, Mali. But we deal with this history chronologically. You have to understand the transatlantic slave trade. First of all, we have to understand that African people have been in the land we call the United States of America going back at least 51,700 years. Okay, and you know, we deal with a number of different books in the class. Also, you don't have to buy any of these books to be able to follow along in the class. One of the books that we use is from Dr. David Imhotep. The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence. Now, his book deals with an African presence in South America going back at least 56,000 years ago, and North America, specifically the United States, going back at least 51,700 years ago. These are the Khoisan, who come from Southern Africa. They have the oldest DNA on the planet. They're the ancestors to the Ainu and the Twa. They go all around the world. And they were here in the U.S. They built pyramid mounds up and down the Mississippi River. There were about 1 million mounds here in North America. Now there are only about 100,000. Okay, so we deal with that. We deal with the teachings that the Moors take into Europe. They bring Europe out of the Dark Ages. They're taking the teachings from ancient Kemet, ancient Egypt into Europe. And this brings Europe out of the Dark Ages. This is going to lead to the transatlantic slave trade happening. All right, so we deal with a lot of history. We'll cover about 50 different articles. We have book references. I mean, you'll learn a lot. And we have to deal with the transatlantic slave trade chronologically, because the transatlantic slave trade does not happen in a vacuum. It is the result of a sequence of historical events that take place, and it deals with the Africans known as the Moors in Europe, the wars that the Moors fight with Europeans, the conflicts that take place, the animosity, the hatred that Europeans develop for these African Moors. When you understand the transatlantic slave trade, you understand it that it is a continuation of the fights, wars between these African Moors and Europeans. The transatlantic slave trade really is Europeans getting revenge on the Moors. It's going to continue. It did not just happen in a vacuum. It is a continuation of what was going on in Europe. Okay? So, check all that out. Look for me, listen to our show, the African History Network show, Sundays, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on 9:10 a.m. Superstation WFDF. We broadcast on our Facebook fan page, the African History Network. We broadcast on, we upload it to YouTube, put it on 8 different podcast platforms. Visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, for more information and to listen to the audio podcast of our show also. African American business owners, email us at customerservice@AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. We'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. We have some new advertisers. The Fast Life 28-Day Challenge. The Fast Life 28-Day Challenge will help you lose the weight you want. It'll help you deal with obesity, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. It is an online coaching program to help members tap into their body's natural ability to repair itself via fasting. In this challenge, the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge focuses on utilizing fasting, eating whole foods, and movement to improve various metabolic conditions like obesity, high blood pressure, pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Okay, and they also have a secret Facebook group to help you as well with tips. They have 3 coaches that help you also. Visit their website, TFL28.com. TFL28.com stands for the Fast Life 28-Day Challenge. They have a new group starting up soon. And then also, if you like soul food, you want to check out the vegan soul food that Mercedes Waffles and More offers you. Visit their website, mercedeswafflesandmore.com, mercedeswafflesandmore.com. They service the New York and New Jersey area. They have a vegan and vegetarian soul food, so it's healthier for you. It tastes good also, and they do catering only. Mercedes Waffles and More. Sometimes you may see them at a special event there in the New York, New Jersey area. But visit their website, mercedeswafflesandmore.com, and they do catering. So you definitely want them to cater your next event, dealing with if you want healthy vegan and vegetarian soul food. Okay. All right, so email us customer service at AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. African American business owners will let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network. And I will be in, so I was in Atlanta for the Juneteenth festival, June 14th through the 16th. I was doing presentations down there and I was a vendor. I will be in Chicago July 13th for the Black Agenda on Tour with Michi X and Jice Johnson. I'll be one of the panelists. So visit their website, theblackagendaontour.com, theblackagendaontour.com, for more information and for information about the venue. That is going to be Saturday, July 13th, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Okay, I'll be there. I'll be one of the panelists. Hip-hop artist, actor, producer David Banner is a special guest. It's hosted by Shay J. There'll be and panelists also include Michi X, Jice Johnson, and Cassiopeia of the Black Mall there in Chicago. Also, okay. So visit the blackagendaontour.com for more information. And then I will be back in Atlanta the weekend of, what is that? The July 20th, I think it is. The weekend of, let's see here. What week is that? Weekend of, July 20th, the July 19th, 20th, and 21st for the Liberated Minds Black Homeschooling Education Expo. The Liberated Minds Black Homeschooling Education Expo taking place at the Piedmont Technical Center. So I'll be a presenter there that Sunday. I'll be a vendor all 3 days. Visit their website, liberatedmindsexpo.com, liberatedmindsexpo.com for more information. Okay, it's a great homeschooling conference for African American parents and children. It's African centered, so a lot of experts in homeschooling African American children are there. They have curriculums, DVDs, books, all types of resources for you. The Liberated Minds Black Homeschooling Education Expo. Okay, so I'll be back in Atlanta for that as well. All right, guys, visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. You can order my DVD lectures. We have my 3 latest presentations, and the one dealing with the history of Juneteenth is fantastic. It's a 3-hour presentation that I did. We have bundle packs there at our website as well. Register for the online course that I'm teaching, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Maafa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. All right, and we'll see you in class. Class meets again Wednesday, June 26th. And remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. What you do for yourself, what you do to yourself, and what you allow other people to do to you and get away with is based upon what you think about yourself. What you think about yourself is based upon what you've been taught about yourself. What you've been taught about yourself is based upon everything you've read, heard, or seen about yourself. Remember, right knowledge corrects wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. We'll talk to you next time. Peace.